The year is 2005. Ferrari have been dominating the sport for the past 5 seasons, and everyone had some questionable fashion choices. Definitely Jarno Trulli. However, this year would be a little bit different. This is the year that they decided to add some new regulations to the cars, so now you could not change tyres from quali till the end of the race, to incentivize harder tyres, to reduce the cornering speed of the cars, changes to the bodyworks of the car, to raise the front wing, bring the rear wings forward, reduce the diffuser height, and cut back on the front of the rear wheel. Finally, the engines had to last for 2 race weekends, meaning that the engines were less powerful. All of these regulations were to make all of the cars a little bit slower and hope for some innovations elsewhere on the cars. And like always, this new regulation change meant that there was quite a switcheroo in the order of the grid, with the upcoming talent at the time of Fernando Alonso being the world champion for this season, with the Renault team 21 points ahead of his rival Kimi Räikkönen and 75 points ahead of his teammate Fisichella. In one season, Fisichella was not the best driver at times. However, I'm not here to talk about the F1 2005 season. I'm actually here to talk about one of the most controversial races in F1 history, starting a full tyre revolution, resulting in Michelin leaving the sport. This is the 2005 United States Grand Prix. So we start quite tamely, with everything going as normal as you'd think in FP1, with the top teams at the time of Renault, McLaren, BAR Honda, the Williams and Toyota all looking pretty nifty at the start of the weekend. However, it's not until we get to FP2 we start to see the issues arise. Now, sometimes in this era of F1, the reserve drivers, aka the third drivers, would be allowed to take part in practice alongside both other drivers. And that meant for the Toyota team, Ricardo Zonta was taking place in his practice session to see what he could learn about the car. However, he didn't get to learn much, as the back left tyre completely exploded on him, making him crash quite drastically off of the track. However, this wasn't the spark that ignited the flame. It was what happened to technically his teammate Ralf Schumacher in the other Toyota, who almost had an identical explosion of the back rear tyre crashing into the wall. That really there was something wrong at this circuit. Now, for the time being, everyone thought that it was Toyota's issue. 2 Toyota cars it happened to. 2 Toyota cars had the tyres explode. However, from the data, Toyota could not explain why their tyres were exploding, and they hadn't had an issue on their side. So they asked Michelin to take a look, and Michelin came back to say 3 to 4 of their teams that they supplied to had the same issue as Toyota's, meaning that almost half the grid potentially had an issue with tyres exploding on them. Michelin were in full panic mode and had to hold a team meeting. After all the chaos of Friday and the Friday night meetings, Saturday morning arrived and Michelin had decided to continue running with their tyres. However, they had asked all of the teams that they supplied, bear in mind, which was basically all of the teams on the grid at the minute. Bridgestone were the other competitor, but only supplied Ferrari, Minardi and Jordan. Michelin asked all of their suppliers to run low fuel runs and to not do any long runs during the practice sessions. So a lot of them were coming into the pits and coming out a lot because they could not put that much stress on the tyres. However, what was baffling to Michelin is they couldn't realistically figure out why this was happening, which would become an issue, because if they couldn't figure out what was happening, that meant all of the tyres potentially had the same issue, and if they couldn't resolve it now, that would mean that every team who had Michelin supplied tyres could not take place in the race as a safety precaution. This led to a qualifying session which was extremely weird, as all of the Michelin teams ran on low fuel setups, which meant they all were extremely rapid, which wasn't anything too uncommon, but it was mainly the Toyotas who looked extremely fast because they had to definitely go for low fuel runs. They all qualified very well, with Trulli taking pole position, with Räikkönen in second, Button in the BAR Honda third, Fisichella in the Renault in fourth, and Schumacher in fifth place. and he was the first Bridgestone tyre user. Even after qualifying, there was still a lot of meetings to be held as they didn't know if they could run these cars for a full race distance, and they really wanted to put a chicane into turn 13 to make sure that the cars weren't going too fast around that corner. However, the FIA were not on board as this is not something they could have tested in time, meaning for them it was too much of a risk to do this just for the Michelin supplied cars. Then Sunday morning came around and lots more meetings were held by Michelin with their teams to figure out exactly what they could do with the FIA, and there was lots of potential ways to work around it that they thought of. They of course had the chicane idea. They also had putting on their pit limiters for that turn 13. However, this would ruin all of their races. At least there would be a race to have. There was even options of making 2 separate lanes where the Bridgestones could go and the Michelin tyres could go. But at the end of all of this, they did realise that not all the teams were going to agree to this, because Bridgestone supplied one of the biggest teams in F1, Ferrari, and they were not on board with this. And if you want to make changes to the circuit, you have to have everyone on board. Now, this worked out perfectly for Ferrari because they were not having a good season. They had failed to get a single win in the first 8 races. It was their worst start to a season that decade. So Schumacher and Barrichello were desperate for a good race, and they smelt it with all of this Michelin issues. So of course, they said they did not want any of this to happen, which meant none of it did. With not all the teams backing them and the FIA thinking it was too risky, none of these changes happened. Which meant coming to the start of the race, we had one of the most crazy formation laps I've ever seen in F1.
Away they go then on the green flag lap, but it's interesting that Raikkonen from P2 chose to switch off his traction control and lay some rubber down, suggesting he thinks he's going to start the race anyway.
Their cars to come in. Well, you know as little about this as we do. Ted Kravitz, maybe you can offer us something.
And that's the same. McLaren, Williams and Renault, I can see where I am at the moment. And they are all clearing 2 Formula One car spaces for each of their cars to come in and retire.
Here comes Alonso, World Championship leader.
You know our plan is for the start. Straight in the pits, please, mate.
Yeah, well, he knows that because he's on his way in already. Looks like teammate Fisichella just in front of him. And I think that McLaren, Toyota, there's the pole sitter Jarno Trulli pouring into the pits, and just listen to the crowd.
I'm open.
Haven't seen anything like it. They're stunned, we're stunned. 2 Ferraris on pit straight. Will it be 2 Jordans and 2 Minardis? Some talk the Minardis won't do it. There's a Jordan.
Below us, who can see that Carter Cayan may well be on for a podium here this afternoon. Who knows what's going to happen in the US Grand Prix? It's the strangest race ever, and it gets underway now. Predictably, Michael Schumacher leads away from Rubens Barrichello. The 2 Jordans, they're going to make a bit of a battle with the Minardi. Looks like we might be losing a Jordan already. I saw smoke earlier, I mentioned it.
Now, what made this formation lap even crazier is something that Fernando Alonso said after the race. He said these exact words: "I was fighting with Kimi for the championship, and he was second on the grid, I think, and I was 6th. I had the instruction, if he goes to the grid, you go to the grid. If he goes to the pit lane, you go to the pit lane. We had all agreed to go to the pit lane, but in case Kimi changed his mind at the last moment, I had to do the same. So there was some stress on the formation lap." Now just imagine how tense that would have been with all of the cars, because if one car, Kimi Raikkonen, went to the grid, that would have meant that a lot of cars would have followed them, and we could have seen a catastrophe with all of the Michelin tyres potentially exploding at turn 13. However, this was not the case, and they all agreed to stop and DNF. However, this meant for the angry crowd who were expecting an F1 race, they got a race with 6 of the 20 drivers starting the race. 2 Ferraris, 2 Jordans and 2 Minardis. So it wasn't even an interesting race, as Ferrari were technically a decent team at the time, but Minardi and Jordan were back markers, meaning that Ferrari finished 1-2, with Schumacher winning by 1.5 seconds to Barrichello and then lapping the rest of the field. The only saving grace was it meant that Monteiro got a podium for Jordan. It would be their only podium of the season, and my god, they sort of deserved it just for finishing that race. But all in all, this has to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, blunders of F1 history in, technically at the time, their 55 years of being an official sport. Now they're 74 years. I still don't think we've seen anything like this, as the fans were angry, the FIA were angry, Michelin were fuming, Bridgestone were the only people who were happy, and Ferrari also, because that meant they got their first race win of the season. And after all of this craziness, it meant that coming into the 2006 season, they did not want a repeat of what they saw Michelin have to do at the 2005 United States Grand Prix. They could not handle this financially. They could not handle this for the sport. It looked terrible, and F1 took a massive hit with their reputation. And F1 reinstated the regulation that you would have to change tyres during the race, which Michelin did not want to do, as they saw it as self-destructing your own tyres. So they refused to make them. Michelin's reputation took a hit. Teams didn't want to be supplied with them as much anymore, and all of these combining together meant that Michelin eventually left the sport in 2006, meaning that Bridgestone eventually had a monopoly on the tyre supplies of each and every team. Now, this wouldn't last forever, as Bridgestone left the sport in 2010, with Pirelli picking up the pieces in 2011. However, since that day, because of the repercussions, we have always had a monopoly on F1 tyres, and we've never seen a tyre war since. And it's crazy to think that all of this happened purely because of one extremely uneventful 2005 Grand Prix. Thank you all for watching.